Sometimes I find myself thinking of my childhood home, modestly sized, Midwestern, and defined by a quiet repression. It was the kind of place where conversations about anything uncomfortable were quickly smothered with platitudes or thought-eliminating cliches. It'll work out. Don't think too much about it. Everything's fine. It is what it is. Even as systems failed us, as jobs dried up, as the world seemed to lurch further and further into chaos, there was a consistent refusal to acknowledge what was happening. It was a way of coping, sure, but it was also something more insidious. It was denial as cultural reflex. Years ago, when I first saw the "This is fine" meme, a cartoon dog sitting in a burning room, sipping coffee, I laughed. How could I not? Its absurdity captures the grotesque mismatch between our reality and how we all too often respond to it by casually denying the legitimacy of the horrors that plague us. The meme captures this perfectly. The dog's absurd calmness is funny because it's us. The dog's refusal to act isn't a glitch. It's a logical outcome of a system that teaches us to accept the flames as inevitable. Before we go any further, I want to quickly let you know about my Patreon. If you enjoy essays like this, you might be interested in an exclusive video I released recently where I explore my new atheist phase and the intellectual development I experienced as a teenager during the Iraq War. It's a deeply personal look at how certain formative experiences shape my current perspective. You can check that out along with other exclusive content by supporting me on Patreon. Since the emergence of this particular meme, I've observed another tendency that is altogether distinct and yet somehow equally symptomatic. There is an insincere sort of ethos to the meme. In some sense, it seems to want to say that to recognize the fire and laugh at it is to confront the sheer scale of systemic collapse. But at the same time, there is a sense in which the fire is too big and too pervasive to be extinguished at this point. We all implicitly recognize this and subsequently retreat into irony, whether we repress the horrors or attempt to ironically distance ourselves from them. The ultimate outcome is inaction on the part of the individual. Both reactions are unconscious attempts to rationalize inaction. We live, as Mark Fisher might say, in a culture defined by reflexive impotence. In essence, it's the pervasive feeling that we know things are bad, but we can't do anything about it. When I think about how people cope with collapse, I see two distinct modes. The first is what I was talking about initially, repression. The insistence that everything is fine, even as the flames creep closer. Obviously, this is what the meme originally skewers. The second mode, though, is newer, perhaps a product of the internet, perhaps something more deeply psychological. It's the fatalistic, we live in hell mentality, a kind of collective sigh. We acknowledge the fire and are therefore superior to those who stick their heads in the sand, but at the same time, we are resigned to burning in this fire because there is no solution to our hellish fate. Hell is eternal and inescapable. And so we performatively acknowledge this in order to garner social capital. I've seen this second mode practically everywhere, especially online. It's the posture of people who wear their despair like a defensive kind of armor, who respond to every crisis, climate collapse, political corruption, economic precarity, with a detached sense of fatalism. But fatalism, like denial, is a form of black and white thinking. It's a way of foreclosing the possibility of action and absolving ourselves of the responsibility to imagine something different. If we live in hell, what's the point of trying to escape? The cognitive process that leads to we live in hell is deceptively seductive. It feels like an incisive political insight, a piercing clarity about the state of the world, but it's actually a trap. It preemptively collapses the complexity of our predicament into a single, unchanging truth. Things are bad, and they'll always be bad. In doing so, it performs the same function as everything is fine. It lets us off the hook. Frederick Jameson's work on postmodernism helps us understand why these modes persist. In postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, Jameson describes how late capitalism tends to produce a ubiquitous sense of historical inertia, a sort of cultural malaise. We are trapped in an eternal present with a pathological inability to think historically. In this world, the threat of systemic collapse becomes background noise, just another feature of the cultural landscape. The flames in This Is Fine are emblematic of this. They are static, unchanging, and they've been transformed into something utterly banal. Jameson also argues that this inertia isn't just a cultural phenomenon, it has a deep-seated psychological valence as well. The inability to act, to intervene in the systems that shape our lives, creates a profound sense of impotence. This impotence is hardly ever acknowledged. Instead, it's displaced. It manifests in consumerism, in distractions, and in the ceaseless churn of memes that allow us to comment on collapse without ever truly confronting it. This Is Fine thrives in this particular context. It's a cultural artifact that perfectly encapsulates Jameson's observation about impotence. Impotence is first and foremost that, a pall on the psyche, the gradual loss of interest in the self and the outside world, very much in formal analogy to Freud's description of mourning. The difference being that one recovers from mourning, Freud shows how, but that the condition of non-productivity, since it is an index of an objective situation that does not change, must be dealt with in another way, a way that, acknowledging its persistence and inevitability, disguises, represses, displaces, and sublimates a persistent and fundamental powerlessness. Memes like This Is Fine don't just reflect our powerlessness, they reinforce it. Their humor operates in the space between recognition and resignation. By laughing at the absurdity of the dog's calmness, we acknowledge the fire, but in a way, we also accept it. This is what Fisher meant when he described capitalist realism, the pervasive sense that there is no alternative to the systems that govern our lives. Memes like this become aestheticized representations of collapse, replicated ad infinitum, and thus banalized, validating our ideological predilections while still being fundamentally paralyzing. When I laugh at This Is Fine, I think of Midwestern repression, the general refusal to confront or acknowledge the chaos of the world. But I also think of myself scrolling through Twitter, shrugging at the headlines about climate disaster or the latest political trash fire. I recognize the fire, but I don't move. I don't grab the extinguisher. Instead, I just laugh. This laughter feels like insight, but it's really a reflex, a way of displacing my own responsibility. To escape this paralysis, we need to break out of the binary thinking that defines both denial and fatalism. Both everything is fine and we live in hell are ideological limits, ways of simplifying complexity into a single, static truth. Real action requires the belief that things are bad, but they can change. Then comes the real challenge, navigating the messy in-between and fleshing out a vision of the future that doesn't so closely resemble hell. Jameson reminds us that this requires more than recognition, it requires imagination. The fire in This Is Fine feels inevitable because we've lost the ability to imagine a world not defined by fire. Late capitalism thrives on this lack of imagination, on the belief that systemic collapse is as natural as gravity. But fires don't start on their own. They emerge from specific systems, and fires can be extinguished. If This Is Fine is a meme about paralysis in the face of dire conditions, then the question we must ask is, what does the third panel look like? What happens when the dog puts down the coffee and picks up the fire extinguisher? Or when he realizes that he isn't alone, and there are others in the room who desperately need his help? The third panel requires imagination, but also action. It requires rejecting the seductive simplicity of everything is fine or we live in hell in favor of something messier and more difficult. It requires acknowledging the fire without accepting it. For me, this isn't just a theoretical question, it's personal. I have spent too much of my life oscillating between denial and irony, between the quiet repression of my social environment and the fatalism of my adult years. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that neither mode serves us. The fire doesn't care whether we ignore it or laugh at it. It's going to burn us either way. So the question remains, what happens when we stop saying this is fine? What happens when we refuse to let the fire define us? That, I think, is the work of our time. It's the work of reclaiming agency, restoring imagination, and refusing to let collapse become banal. It's the work of creating the third panel.